Reid's mornings were a tapestry of muted grays. The city outside his third-floor apartment window hummed with a predictable drone, a constant undercurrent to his own quiet existence. He worked with data, a meticulous dance of numbers and logic that filled his days with an almost meditative rhythm. Coffee, spreadsheets, the occasional polite nod to a colleague, then the subway's rumble home. It was a life built on order, on the absence of surprises. He liked it that way. The disruption arrived not as a seismic shock, but as a small, official-looking envelope slipped beneath his door one Tuesday morning. No stamp, no postal mark, just heavy cream paper with an embossed crest. Curiosity, a rare guest, nudged him. Inside, a single sheet of paper, crisp and formal, detailed the passing of a distant relative he barely remembered, a great-aunt, perhaps, or a second cousin once removed. The name, Elara Vance, resonated with the faint echo of a holiday card from childhood, a signature on a photo he couldn't quite place. The letter, from a solicitor, spoke of an estate, an inheritance. Reid read the word inheritance again. His life offered little room for such unexpected windfalls. His apartment was rented, his possessions few and functional. He owned no property beyond his modest savings. The solicitor's firm requested his presence for a reading of the will. A week later, he sat across a polished mahogany desk from a man whose suit seemed tailored from shadow itself. The solicitor's voice was dry, precise, detailing the specifics of Elara Vance's surprisingly substantial, if peculiar, legacy. The bulk of the estate, the solicitor began, adjusting his spectacles, comprises a property. A cabin, to be precise. He was located deep within the Blackwood Forest, near the coast. Reid felt a flicker of something he couldn't name. A cabin? He had pictured a small sum of money, perhaps a piece of antique jewelry he'd politely decline. Blackwood Forest, he asked. The name itself sounded like a place from a forgotten tale. The solicitor nodded, retrieving a thick file. Indeed. Quite remote. Has been in the family for generations, though it's been largely uninhabited for decades. A place of historical significance, some might say. He paused, looking over his spectacles, a hint of something unreadable in his gaze. It's been said to stand on an ancient burial ground. The words hung in the air, heavy and unexpected. It sounded like something out of a book, not a legal document. He felt an obligation, a strange pull, to see this place. To understand why it was his now. The journey was long, a gradual shedding of the familiar. The city's sprawl gave way to suburbs, then rolling farmland, and finally, dense, encroaching woodland. The asphalt roads narrowed, cracked, eventually becoming little more than gravel paths winding between towering, ancient trees whose branches laced together, obscuring the sky. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine needles. He passed a few isolated farmhouses, their paint peeling, their windows like vacant eyes. This was not the orderly world he knew. This was a place where things might happen that defied spreadsheets and logic. After what felt like an eternity, the road finally opened slightly, offering a glimpse of the distant, turbulent sea. And there it was, a sentinel against the bruised horizon, an abandoned lighthouse. It stood alone on a craggy outcrop, a testament to forgotten purpose, to the relentless march of decay. The sight of it, stark and desolate, deepened the unease that had been slowly coiling in Reid's gut. He continued, the cabin's directions vague, relying on landmarks the solicitor had scribbled on a napkin, turn left at the twisted oak, then follow the creek. The creek, when he found it, was a sluggish ribbon of murky water, its banks overgrown with thorny bushes. The path beside it was barely discernible, choked with fallen leaves and moss. He parked the car, its engine ticking in the sudden quiet, and stepped out. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of wet earth and something else, something metallic and faint, like old rust or stagnant water. The cabin appeared suddenly through a curtain of tangled branches, almost as if the forest had exhaled it into view. A thin, skeletal porch sagged precariously, and the front door, made of thick, weathered planks, looked like it hadn't been opened in years. Weeds grew tall around its foundation, reclaiming the ground. Reid stood there, a city man in sensible shoes, staring at this relic. This was it. This was Elara Vance's legacy, the ancient cabin, the burial ground. It was not the musty aroma of simple neglect, but something deeper, more ingrained, like the very wood had absorbed centuries of forgotten things. He stood in the main room, dust motes dancing in the weak light filtering through grimy window panes, the silence profound enough to make his ears ache. The words of the estate lawyer, about an ancient burial ground, echoed in his mind, a jarring counterpoint to the determined practicality he usually applied to life. He dismissed it as morbid folklore, a quirk of the legal world, and nothing more. This was an inheritance, a new chapter, not a ghost story. He spent the first afternoon simply observing, walking from room to room. The cabin was larger than it appeared from the outside, a sprawling structure of rough-hewn timber and uneven stone. Every floorboard groaned under his weight, every latch rattled with a sigh of protest. He tried to open a window in the kitchen, but it was jammed solid, refusing to budge. A faint gust of wind seemed to sigh through the gaps around the frame anyway, carrying with it a faint, almost imperceptible scent of decay. He told himself it was just the forest, the rich, decomposing undergrowth that surrounded the cabin like a dark, verdant cloak. As dusk began to bleed into the forest, painting the sky in bruised purples and oranges, Reid started to unpack the few boxes he'd brought. He arranged some books on a crooked shelf, his hands brushing away layers of fine grit. He heard a soft thud from the floor above, a sound like a heavy book falling onto wood. He paused, listening. Only the distant murmur of the wind through the pines answered him. He shrugged, attributing it to an old house settling. They made noises. It was natural. Later, while boiling water for instant coffee on a temperamental propane stove, a distinct scratching sound began from behind the wall near the sink. It wasn't the frantic scurry of a mouse, but a slow, deliberate rasp, like something dragging claws across plaster. Reid tapped the wall. The sound ceased. He waited, his breath held. Nothing. He exhaled slowly, a slight tremor in his hand as he poured the hot water. Probably a squirrel, he reasoned, trying to find a way into the warmth. The cabin was old, after all, and the forest was right outside. The following day, Reid began the arduous task of cleaning. He found an old broom, its bristles worn to nubs, and started sweeping the accumulated dust and debris. He noticed a small, intricately carved wooden bird on the mantelpiece above the fireplace. He hadn't seen it yesterday. He was certain it hadn't been there. He picked it up, examining the crude, almost disturbing details of its wings and beak. He placed it back down, carefully, then continued sweeping. 10 minutes later, as he turned to empty the dustpan, he glanced back at the mantel. The bird was gone. He scoured the floor, checked behind the few pieces of furniture, but it was nowhere. He must have misplaced it, or perhaps it had fallen and rolled under something. He refused to entertain any other notion. He spent the afternoon clearing a path to the back of the property, hacking away at overgrown brambles and thickets. Through a break in the dense canopy, in the far distance, he caught a glimpse of something stark against the muted horizon, the skeletal silhouette of an abandoned lighthouse. Its weathered stones seemed to drink the light, a silent, solitary sentinel overlooking something unseen. Its presence, so far inland, felt profoundly out of place, a monument to a coastline that no longer existed, or perhaps never had. He wondered what its story was, a new mystery to distract him from the minor oddities within the cabin walls. That evening, the disturbances became less subtle. He was in the small, cluttered study, trying to make sense of a pile of old ledgers left on a desk. He looked up, startled, but the sound didn't dissipate. It rose and fell, not like the wind, but like a sustained, sorrowful note played on an ancient instrument. He stood, moving to the window, peering out into the deepening gloom. The trees thrashed, their branches like skeletal arms, but the sound, that resonant hum, felt like it was coming from inside the cabin. It was too deep, too steady for simple wind. He walked toward the sound, following it to the far end of the study, where a heavy, built-in bookshelf stood. The hum seemed to emanate from behind it. He pushed against the shelf, grunting with effort, but it was anchored firmly to the wall. He ran his hand along the dusty wood, searching for a loose panel, a hidden catch. His fingers snagged on a small, almost invisible seam in the molding near the bottom. He pressed, and with a soft click, a narrow, shallow drawer sprang open. Inside, nestled among dried leaves and what looked like brittle, petrified flower petals, was a small, leather-bound journal. Its cover was worn smooth, almost black with age, and embossed with a symbol he didn't recognize, a jagged circle intersected by 3 radiating lines. He pulled it out, the leather cool and dry beneath his fingertips. The practical explanations were starting to fray. He was no longer just dealing with an old house. It was no longer just an aroma, it was a presence, clinging to his clothes, his hair, a phantom echo that made his throat feel perpetually raw. He tried to air out the place, to scrub away the ingrained mustiness, but the smell was too deep, too fundamental, as if the very wood of the structure exhaled it with every settling sigh. The initial unease, a gnawing suspicion that had first pricked at the edges of his perception, had sharpened into something more defined, more insistent. It began subtly, with the distinct creak of floorboards above him when he knew, with chilling certainty, that he was the only living soul on the ground floor. Or the faint, undeniable clink of ceramic from the kitchen, a sound of plates shifting, when he was sequestered in the study, miles from the room. He'd pause, heart thrumming a frantic rhythm against his ribs, listening, always listening, blaming the old house settling, the persistent whisper of the wind through the eaves. One evening, a heavy, leather-bound book on local flora, which he'd left securely closed on the small side table by the hearth, lay wide open when he returned from gathering firewood. It wasn't just open, it was splayed flat, its spine protesting with a faint, dry crackle, as if someone had been pressing down on it with deliberate force. The page displayed a faded, intricate illustration of a rare, bell-shaped flower, its petals a deep, almost bruised purple. He hadn't touched that book in days. He hadn't even looked at it. He started setting small, inconsequential traps, a desperate attempt to cling to his sanity, to prove his rational mind still held sway. A matchstick propped delicately against a cupboard door. a loose thread laid precisely across the spine of a book. Always, they were disturbed. The matchstick would be on the floor, the thread tangled, crumpled. He'd tell himself it was vibrations from the old foundation, a draft from a faulty window. But then he found his grandfather's old compass, a heavy brass instrument he'd placed squarely on his desk, now sitting on the floor, its glass face cracked, the needle spinning wildly, aimlessly, as if lost in some unseen magnetic storm. The rationalizations began to crumble like dry clay, sifting through his fingers, leaving him with nothing but stark, undeniable fact. He was not imagining things. He was not tired, or stressed, or seeing patterns where none existed. Something was happening in this cabin. Something that defied logic, that mocked his composure with every subtle shift and unseen movement. He couldn't stay here without understanding. He needed answers, and quickly. His distant relative, the one who had left him this place, had lived here for decades. What had they known? What had they done? He began his research with a frantic, almost desperate energy, driving into the nearest small town. Its main street was lined with clapboard storefronts, culminating in a single, squat brick building that housed the public library. The librarian, a woman with tight gray curls and spectacles perched on her nose, gave him a wary smile when he explained his interest in the cabin's history. The old Blackwood place. She murmured, her gaze lingering on him a moment too long, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. Been empty for a long time before. Reid spent hours poring over dusty tomes and brittle newspaper clippings, the smell of old paper mixing with the metallic tang he still carried. The cabin, built generations ago, stood on ground that locals had always avoided. Unlucky, one old article from the 1930s claimed, describing a string of peculiar livestock deaths and crop failures in the immediate vicinity. Another, a yellowed obituary from the 1950s for one of his distant relatives' ancestors, mentioned their deep connection to the land and unwavering commitment to ancient traditions. The wording was vague, almost poetic, but it prickled Reid's skin. Ancient traditions? What kind? He discovered a mention of the family's earliest arrival, not as settlers, but as caretakers of the land, a title that struck him as profoundly odd. Caretakers of what, for whom? There was a fleeting reference in a turn-of-the-century county record about land disputes, not with neighbors, but with a local indigenous community over sacred ground, though the details were frustratingly sparse. The legal jargon was dense, but the underlying tension was clear. A particularly disturbing passage in a local folklore collection, compiled in the 1970s, spoke of the winding path, a concept tied directly to the forest near the cabin. Hungry Earth. His eyes scanned through an old regional almanac, dated 1912, detailing local landmarks. Amidst descriptions of fishing docks and general stores, a small paragraph caught his attention. The abandoned lighthouse, a sentinel against the raging sea, stands as a testament to bygone eras of maritime trade. Local lore suggests its light, long extinguished, occasionally flickers back to life during the deepest nights, a beacon for something lost. The text didn't explicitly link it to the cabin or his family, but the mention of something lost and its proximity to the coastline, not far from the cabin's forest, made his stomach clench. Why would a lighthouse, abandoned for decades, still have such a vivid, unsettling legend attached to it? And why did it feel, with an inexplicable certainty, connected to the pervasive sense of loss he'd felt since arriving? He found no explicit mention of his specific distant relative's death, beyond the brief, almost clinical notice in the local paper. no cause given, just suddenly. It was the culmination of these small, insidious details that truly unsettled him. He wasn't just inheriting a cabin, he was inheriting a legacy, a responsibility he didn't understand, tied to rituals and a hungry earth. The fragments were coalescing, forming a terrifying picture of a family bound to something ancient and demanding. The cabin wasn't just a house, it was a cage, or perhaps, a sacrificial altar. He drove back to the cabin as dusk bled across the sky, painting the western horizon in bruised purples and bruised oranges. The forest pressed in on either side of the narrow road like watchful, unblinking eyes. The metallic tang of the cabin seemed to intensify as he approached, a silent, sickening welcome. He had answers, yes, but they only served to deepen the horror. He'd tried to scrub it away, to air out his few belongings, but the phantom odor persisted, a constant, low-frequency hum beneath his skin. It was a mark, he realized, a claim. He couldn't stay still. He needed answers, something concrete to anchor him against the rising tide of his own fear. His fingers, calloused from weeks of exploring the cabin's forgotten corners, traced the rough grain of an old, built-in bookshelf. He'd already checked every book, every drawer, every loose floorboard he could find. Yet, a persistent intuition, a prickle at the back of his neck, told him there was more. He ran his hand along the bottom shelf, where the wood met the stone foundation. It was a subtle difference, a slight protrusion, barely perceptible. He pressed, pushed, then pulled. With a soft groan of ancient timber, a narrow panel slid inward, revealing a cavity too small for a drawer, too deep for a simple cubby. Inside, nestled in a shroud of dust and cobwebs, lay a single, leather-bound journal, its cover warped and brittle, and beneath it, a folded, yellowed piece of parchment. Reid's breath hitched. This was it. He pulled out the journal, its pages crumbling at the edges, and then the parchment. It was a crude map, hand-drawn, showing the meandering coastline and a distinctive, stark silhouette, a lighthouse. A single, faded word was scrawled beneath it, the witness. His gaze flicked from the map to the journal. The cabin was a trap, he realized, but perhaps the lighthouse held the key to its escape. He had to go. The journey to the coast was a jarring contrast to the oppressive quiet of the forest. The dense canopy eventually thinned, giving way to sparse, wind-battered pines, then scrubland, and finally, the vast, churning expanse of the ocean. The road, little more than a gravel track, dissolved into a barely discernible path that hugged the cliff edge, precarious and unforgiving. He parked his truck as far as he dared, then continued on foot, the wind tearing at his clothes, whipping his hair across his face. The roar of the waves was a constant, deafening assault, drowning out all other sounds, even his own ragged breathing. And then he saw it. The abandoned lighthouse stood sentinel on a jagged promontory, a skeletal finger against the bruised sky. Its brickwork was crumbling, stained with salt and guano, its glass lantern room long since shattered, leaving gaping, empty sockets. The iron railings of the winding stairs were rusted into delicate lacework, some segments missing entirely, plunging into the crashing surf below. It looked like a monument to a forgotten disaster, utterly desolate. The air around the lighthouse felt different, thinner, charged with a strange, static energy. He pushed open the heavy, barnacled door, which groaned in protest, its hinges screaming like tormented spirits. Inside, the gloom was absolute, broken only by slivers of light filtering through cracks in the masonry and the gaping lantern room high above. The air was thick with the scent of rust, damp stone, and something else, a faint, cloying sweetness, like decaying flowers or stagnant water. The map had been clear, the witness holds the truth. He reached the lantern room, the wind howling through the broken panes, tearing at the few remaining shards of glass. Below, the ocean churned, a relentless, hungry maw. His eyes scanned the circular room, the circular ledge where the light mechanism once stood. Nothing. Just more rust, more decay. Had he come all this way for nothing? He knelt, running his hand along the inner wall, just above the ledge. His fingers snagged on something. A faint indentation. He pressed harder, pushing against the rough stone. With a soft click, a section of the wall, no larger than his hand, recessed slightly. Inside, protected from the elements, lay another object, a small, wooden box, intricately carved, its surface smooth and cool beneath his touch. His heart hammered against his ribs. He felt it. He pulled the box free, his fingers trembling. The lid was held fast by a tarnished silver clasp. He unlatched it, the click impossibly loud in the howling wind. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a stack of brittle, yellowed pages, bound loosely with twine. It wasn't a journal, but a collection of letters, entries, and diagrams, written in a spidery, archaic hand. He unfolded the top page, the paper crackling like dry leaves. The words blurred, then sharpened into focus, "The land demands its due. Our ancestors made the pact, not with God, but with the earth itself, with the spirit that sleeps beneath the roots of the forest. For bountiful harvests, for protection from the blight, a life must be given. A firstborn, every third generation, to bind the pact, to appease the guardian of the soil." Reid felt the blood drain from his face. A pact. A sacrifice. His lineage. The words swam before his eyes, each one a hammer blow to his understanding of the world. He read on, skimming through generations of entries, each one detailing a birth, a life, and then, invariably, a disappearance, a passing into the earth. The names blurred, but the pattern was horrifyingly clear. The cycle continues. May the land be sated. The cabin's metallic tang, the scent that clung to him, suddenly made a horrific sense. It wasn't just damp earth and pine, it was the lingering essence of what had been taken, what had been given. The entity wasn't just in the cabin, it was the land, or a part of it, an ancient, hungry intelligence that demanded its due. And his distant relative, the one who had suddenly died, had been the latest offering. He wasn't just inheriting a cabin, he was inheriting a debt. A generational curse. The abandoned lighthouse groaned around him, the wind shrieking through the broken glass like a chorus of tormented voices. He was next. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, stealing his breath. He had found his answers, but they were far worse than any nightmare he could have imagined. He clutched the pages, the terrible truth burning in his hands, and knew, with absolute certainty, that the entity was already coming for him. It had permeated the cabin, and now, he understood, it permeated him. The entity wasn't a guest, not a squatter. It was the very marrow of this place, an extension of the land itself, and it had tasted him. He stared at his reflection in the grimy window pane, the faint outline of the forest a skeletal backdrop. His eyes, usually sharp, now held a frantic tremor. He felt porous. As if the cabin's oppressive atmosphere wasn't just around him but seeping into his bones. The air grew thick, pressing in, a palpable weight that made his chest ache. Every creak of the old timbers was a whisper, every gust of wind a sigh that seemed to brush against his ear, cold and intimate. The first overt manifestation was subtle, a trick of the light. He blinked, rubbing at his eyes, but the sensation of something moving just beyond his peripheral vision persisted. No answer. He walked into the small kitchen, the metallic tang stronger here, almost a taste on his tongue. A ceramic mug, one he'd left on the counter, now lay shattered on the floor, shards glinting like broken teeth. He hadn't touched it. He hadn't heard it fall. His breath hitched. This wasn't his imagination. This was real. A wave of vertigo swept over him, the world tilting precariously. The walls of the kitchen seemed to bulge inward, the ceiling to press down. The familiar pattern of the aged wallpaper began to writhe, the floral motifs twisting into grotesque, leering faces that seemed to grimace at him. He could hear a low, guttural hum resonating from the floorboards beneath his feet, a sound that vibrated deep in his chest. It felt like the cabin was alive, and it was breathing. He needed to get out. His gaze fell upon a stack of old papers he'd unearthed days ago, documents belonging to his distant relative. Amidst yellowed deeds and tax receipts, a faded, hand-drawn map caught his eye. It was crudely sketched, showing the winding forest. Roads, the cabin marked with a small X, and further out, almost at the edge of the paper, a distinct, carefully drawn symbol, a lighthouse. Next to it, in spidery, faded ink, was a single word: sanctuary? Sanctuary. The word resonated with a desperate hope. Perhaps there, away from the cabin's immediate grasp, he could find clarity, or a way to fight back. He snatched the map, his hands trembling. The entity was here, in the cabin, but maybe its influence didn't stretch to the coast. The drive was a blur of heightened senses. He gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, forcing himself to focus on the road ahead, on the promise of the sea. Finally, the forest thinned, giving way to scrubland, and then, the vast, churning gray of the ocean. Perched on a desolate bluff overlooking the tumultuous waves, stood the abandoned lighthouse. It was a stoic sentinel of rusted iron and crumbling brick, its windows long since shattered, gaping like empty eye sockets. He stepped out, the wind immediately tearing at his clothes, whipping his hair across his face. The lighthouse seemed to lean into the wind, an ancient, weary giant. He walked towards it, his boots crunching on the loose gravel and broken shells. At the top, in the empty lantern room, the wind shrieked through the broken panes. He scanned the room, his eyes darting over the peeling paint, the rusted mechanisms. In a shallow alcove, half hidden beneath a pile of seabird guano and splintered wood, he found it. It was a small, leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and brittle, its pages swollen with damp. He carefully opened it. The handwriting was his relative's, unmistakable, though more frantic, more desperate than anything he'd seen. The entries were disjointed, rambling, but a pattern emerged, a horrifying narrative. The lighthouse, he read, was not a sanctuary. It was the origin. The place where the pact had been formalized, generations ago. The place where the first offering had been made to the entity that claimed the land, and by extension, the cabin. The blood, one entry scrawled, barely legible, it runs deeper here. The promise was made here. As he stared, the stain began to shimmer, to deepen, to spread. A low, resonant hum filled the tower, not from the wind, but from deep within the structure itself, a sound that vibrated in his teeth, his very bones. The air grew impossibly heavy, crushing. It was not in a language he knew, yet he understood its intent, its hunger. It was a possessive snarl, an ancient claim. He dialed the number of the researcher he'd spoken to, the one who'd dismissed his initial concerns as overactive imagination. The phone rang once, twice. On the third ring, a distorted, guttural sound replaced the dial tone, a wet, choking gasp, followed by the researcher's voice, not speaking words, but screaming, a raw, terrified sound that abruptly cut off with a sickening crunch. The phone slipped from Reid's nerveless fingers, clattering on the gritty floor. The scream echoed in his mind, sharp and real. The entity wasn't confined to the cabin, or even the forest. Its tendrils stretched further, touched others. There was no escape. The lighthouse, the cabin, the very land itself, it was all a part of the same monstrous, hungry being. He was caught, trapped in a web that spanned generations, and now, it was tightening around him, and everyone he knew. The reddish-brown stain on the lantern room floor pulsed, a slow, viscous throb that seemed to draw the very light from the air. Reid felt a cold, slick dread seep into his bones, colder than the ocean wind that howled outside the thick glass. The stain deepened, not just in color, but in texture, as if its surface had become a shallow, dark pool reflecting nothing but an abyssal hunger. He saw no specific images, just an intensification, a malevolent presence coalescing within the ancient mark. This was no mere rust, this was something alive, something that remembered. He needed to leave. Now. He wrenched his gaze away, the very act requiring a physical effort, and stumbled towards the spiraling iron staircase. He pressed on, his jaw tight, refusing to yield to the creeping panic. He burst from the base of the lighthouse, the salty, raw air a welcome shock against his face, only to find the forest waiting. It was a solid, impenetrable wall of gnarled trunks and skeletal branches, far denser and more menacing than he remembered. The familiar path he'd followed to reach the coast was gone, swallowed by an unnatural overgrowth. He pushed forward, forcing his legs to move, navigating the tangled underbrush. He walked, then ran, crashing through thickets, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The wind, which had been a mournful wail at the lighthouse, now seemed to carry voices, indistinct and ancient, just beyond the edge of hearing. He stumbled over a root, falling hard onto the damp earth, the lantern clattering from his grip. It rolled a few feet, its beam flickering wildly, illuminating a small, moss-covered cairn he swore had not been there moments before. He crawled towards it, his hands scraping against the rough stones. Tucked into a crevice at the base of the cairn was a small, crudely carved wooden figurine. It depicted a hunched, distorted figure, its limbs bound with what looked like thick vines, its head thrown back in a silent scream. He recognized the style, vaguely, from a fleeting glimpse of an illustration in one of the dusty journals he'd found in the cabin, a symbol, a ward, or perhaps a sacrifice. The entity wasn't confined to the cabin, nor even to the lighthouse. It was woven into the very fabric of this place, an ancient blight that extended through the earth, the trees, the wind itself. This forest was not merely overgrown, it was actively hostile, a conscious barrier. He scrambled to his feet, clutching the figurine, the wood strangely warm in his hand, almost feverish. He stumbled on, driven by a desperate, primal need to escape, to find any sign of the world beyond this suffocating green prison. Minutes stretched into an eternity. He pushed through a particularly dense stand of pines, their needles scratching at his face and arms, and burst into a small clearing. The clearing was familiar. Too familiar. He had circled back. he had made no progress. The realization hit him like a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs. The forest had played with him, leading him in a cruel, mocking loop. He sank to his knees, the wooden figurine falling from his numbed fingers. His breath hitched, a choked sound of despair. It wasn't just thwarting his escape, it was savoring his torment, breaking him down piece by agonizing piece. His resolve, once a steel rod, now felt like brittle glass, cracking under an immense, unseen pressure. The stain deepened, not just in color, but in texture, a sickening, fleshy undulation. It began to spread, not like a liquid seeping, but like something unfurling. Tendrils, dark and glistening, stretched across the rough-hewn floorboards, seeking purchase. Reid stumbled back, his knuckles white where he gripped the cold metal railing. The glass panels, once a barrier against the storm, seemed to press inward, distorting the churning gray sea into a monstrous, indistinct blur. The hum intensified, a low drone that grated against his teeth, a silent scream building within his skull. The stain reached the wall, climbing with an unnatural speed, adhering to the stone with a wet, sucking sound. It pulsed faster now, a furious, living thing, and within its depths, colors began to swirl: deep maroons, bruised purples, sickly greens. It wasn't just a stain, it was a window, or perhaps a focal point for something vast and incomprehensible. Then, a flicker. Not of the lantern, which had dimmed to an ember glow, but within the swirling mass itself. An image, fleeting and horrifying, burst into Reid's mind without warning, a searing flash of memory that wasn't his own. He saw the relative, hunched and terrified, carving symbols into a wooden beam, his eyes wide with a desperate, frantic fear that mirrored Reid's own. He saw the cabin, not as he knew it, but raw, newly built, surrounded by an untouched, primeval forest. The hum intensified, becoming a piercing shriek that threatened to tear Reid's eardrums. He clapped his hands over his ears, but the sound was inside him, a vibration in his bones, a tremor in his very soul. Not in a clearing, but around a newly dug pit, disturbingly symmetrical. A circle of people, ancestors, their faces grim, their hands clasped, bound and struggling, laid at the center. The glint of a crude blade. A pact, whispered in a language Reid didn't understand, yet its meaning was horrifyingly clear: sustenance, protection, blood for earth, life for peace. The entity was not a ghost. It was something far older, far more fundamental. It was the pact itself, a living, hungry consequence of an ancient bargain. It was the guardian of the burial ground, the land's ravenous memory, awakened by the breaking of the pact, by the relatives' desperate attempt to sever ties. It didn't seek to harm them out of malice, but out of hunger, a primal need for the life force that had been promised to it. It was a symbiotic horror, a parasitic warden that had protected the land and its occupants, so long as it was fed. The images shifted, faster, more chaotic. Reid saw the slow, creeping decay of his family line, the mysterious illnesses, the sudden disappearances, the unexplainable misfortunes that had plagued his ancestors, all leading to this moment. Each death, each tragedy, a small offering, a patch to the crumbling pact, until the relative, in his fear, had tried to starve it, sealing his own fate and awakening its full, terrible power. The demands of the entity slammed into Reid's consciousness with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't just blood, it was a specific kind of offering. A continuation of the pact. A life, freely given, of the bloodline. Not a murder, but a sacrifice, ritualistic and profound, to renew the ancient bargain. It demanded the ultimate price, a life to satiate its hunger, to re-establish the balance that his ancestors had so carelessly disturbed. The cabin was merely its anchor, the focal point of its power, but its influence stretched across the land, reaching into the very veins of his family. The sacrifice required was nothing less than a willing surrender, a final, terrible act of devotion to the land, to the entity, to the unbroken lineage of fear and appeasement. And Reid understood, with a sickening certainty, that the relative, in his final, desperate moments, had been trying to understand how to fulfill that terrible requirement, or perhaps, how to escape it. The swirling colors in the stain faded, the tendrils slowly retracting, leaving behind only the viscous, reddish-brown pool, pulsing faintly, a promise of its return. Reid was left gasping, his body trembling, his mind reeling from the deluge of horrific truths. The ocean wind outside the abandoned lighthouse still howled, but now, it sounded like a lament for the living, a mournful dirge for the price of ancient sins. He knew what he faced. He knew what it wanted. Reid stepped onto the cabin's porch, the wood groaning beneath his weight as if in protest. A storm was brewing, the sky overhead a bruised purple, and the ancient pines surrounding the clearing began to sway, their branches scraping against each other like skeletal fingers. He could feel it, a cold, hungry awareness emanating from deep within the structure, a vastness that dwarfed the small building. This wasn't a dwelling, it was a maw. He clutched the satchel tighter, its contents a desperate gamble. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was the brittle, salt-stained journal he'd found hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the abandoned lighthouse. The relative, in their final, desperate days, had scribbled a fragmented account of the pact, of its true nature, and a chilling, almost impossible path to sever it. Reid had found them, or at least, a terrible, demanding set of instructions. He pushed through, the threshold feeling like a membrane, sticky and resistant. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light that pierced the grimy windows, but they moved erratically, swirling against invisible currents. He could feel its presence now, not a singular point, but a pervasive pressure, like being submerged in a viscous fluid. The very wood of the cabin seemed to writhe, the grain on the floorboards shifting, the knots in the ceiling beams appearing to open and close like lidless eyes. A low thrumming vibrated through the soles of his boots, a sound that resonated deep within his chest, threatening to shake his teeth loose. He moved to the center of the main room, where the crude, rough-hewn table stood, scarred and ancient. This was the heart of it, the nexus. He placed the satchel on the table, retrieving the items he prepared, a bowl of coarse sea salt, a bundle of dried herbs that smelled faintly of sage and something bitter, and a tarnished silver knife. The journal lay open beside them, its faded ink detailing the gruesome specificities of the ritual. The relative had only managed to transcribe fragments, but they were enough. He saw flashes, his own reflection distorted, a snarling parody, then the face of the relative, contorted in silent agony. This was the entity, the pact itself, a living hunger, a consequence awakened by its attempted severance. It was the land's ravenous memory, manifesting as a psychological assault, seeking to break him before he could act. The salt first, a perimeter. His hands trembled as he poured a thin, unbroken line around the table, the grains crunching under his fingers. As he completed the circle, the entity recoiled, a sudden, sharp gasp of cold air that made the cabin shudder. Then it pressed back, harder. The walls groaned, the sound like a monstrous intake of breath. The windows rattled violently, despite the stillness inside the cabin. He heard the distinct sound of something heavy dragging itself across the floor in the room above, then a sickening thump directly over his head. The journal explained the core of the pact. it wasn't merely a bargain for protection or prosperity, but a blood oath, binding a lineage to the land itself, ensuring its vitality through periodic, ultimate sacrifices. The relative's death had been an attempt to offer themselves as the final, singular sacrifice, a desperate bid to end the cycle. But it had failed. It had only reawakened the entity, making it stronger, hungrier, demanding what it was owed. Reveal/discovery, the relative hadn't broken the pact, they had merely triggered its full, terrifying awakening. The journal's final, frantic entry detailed the true horror. The pact required not just a life, but a severance. A severing of the bloodline's connection to the land, an act so profound it would tear the entity from its ancient roots. And the only way to achieve it was through a ritual of self-rejection, a symbolic, yet painfully real, act of disinheritance. Reid wasn't just breaking a bargain, he was erasing himself from its ledger, a spiritual suicide. He picked up the bundle of herbs, crushing them in his fist, releasing their bitter aroma. The air around him shimmered, distorting his vision. Embrace your purpose. He ignored it. This wasn't about giving himself to it. It was about tearing himself away. He placed the crushed herbs into the bowl, then, with the silver knife, made a shallow cut across his palm. Blood welled up, bright and stark against his skin. He squeezed his hand, letting the drops fall into the bowl, mixing with the herbs. As the first drop hit the mixture, the cabin screamed. It was not a sound, but a tearing sensation in his chest, a wave of pure, concentrated agony that buckled his knees. The floorboards beneath him writhed, splinters digging into his skin. The air thickened, suffocating. He felt as though countless unseen hands were pulling at him, trying to drag him down, to absorb him into the hungry earth. He fought through the pain, through the dizzying assault on his senses. This was it. The ultimate stand. He had to break the pact, not just for himself, but for the countless others, for the very memory of his lineage that this entity sought to consume. With a desperate, guttural cry, he plunged the silver knife into the center of the table, driving it deep into the ancient wood, directly through the bowl of blood and herbs, pinning it in place. The cabin convulsed. A deafening crack echoed through the space as a long, jagged fissure split the wooden table, running from the knife's hilt down to the floor, through the very foundation of the cabin. The silver knife, cool and sharp, bit into his palm. The crushed herbs, bitter and earthy, darkened instantly, absorbing the crimson offering. A low, guttural moan echoed from the very timbers of the cabin, a sound that resonated not in his ears, but in the marrow of his bones. It was a sound of ancient hunger, abruptly sated, or perhaps, violently denied. The cabin shuddered. Not the familiar creak of old wood settling, but a profound, internal tremor, like a colossal beast drawing a ragged, final breath. The oppressive chill that had clung to every surface, seeped into every pore, evaporated, leaving behind a sudden, almost sterile warmth. Then, an absolute silence descended, heavy and complete, broken only by the frantic thrum of his own heartbeat against his ribs. He felt, not just from the fear and the exertion, but a deeper, more fundamental emptiness. A piece of him, a sliver of his very essence, felt torn away, leaving a jagged, aching cavity in his mind. He tried to recall a specific memory, a face, a laugh that had once brought him comfort, but the details blurred, becoming indistinct, like smoke dissolving into the air. He knew the person existed, knew the feeling was important, but the vibrant clarity, the emotional resonance, was gone. A blank space where something precious used to be. This was the cost. He didn't remember leaving the cabin. He drove, not with a destination in mind, but with an animalistic need to put as much distance as possible between himself and that place. The engine hummed a monotonous drone, a counterpoint to the buzzing emptiness in his head. He drove until the trees thinned, until the air grew sharp with the tang of salt and decay, until the skeletal finger of the abandoned lighthouse rose against the dawn sky. It stood on a desolate promontory, a stark, weather-beaten sentinel overlooking a churning, gray sea. Its brickwork was crumbling, stained with salt spray and generations of neglect. The windows were gaping, empty sockets, and the rusted iron lantern housing was a jagged crown against the overcast sky. It was a place of vast, open spaces, of relentless wind and crashing waves, the antithesis of the suffocating, ancient woods. He parked the car, the tires crunching on loose shale, and simply stared. He spent days there, holed up in the base of the lighthouse, the wind a constant mournful howl through the broken panes. He had instinctively grabbed a satchel before fleeing the cabin, filled with the scattered family documents he had been poring over. Now, amidst the debris of bird nests and flaking paint, he spread them out on the grimy concrete floor. He was searching, not for answers to the pact anymore, but for understanding of the cost. He picked through brittle letters, faded photographs, and the tattered, leather-bound journal of his great-great-grandfather. He read of fear, of desperation, of attempts to appease or escape the entity. He found mentions of the binding, the sacrifice, and cryptic references to the lineage. Then, tucked into a false bottom of a small, wooden box he'd also snatched, he found it. Not a letter, but a single, folded sheet of parchment, brittle with age, covered in a spidery, almost illegible script. It was a log entry, dated over a century ago, written by a different ancestor, one whose name he barely recognized from the family tree. The ritual was performed. The cabin, for now, is quiet. But the fool believed it was an end. It is merely a slumber. The blood offered does not banish, it binds. It creates a tether, a new vessel, a fresh path for its eventual return. The cost is not merely a memory, but a promise. A promise made not just by the sacrificer, but by all who share his blood. The entity does not die. It merely waits for the next in the line to awaken it, for the pact is eternal. It knows my blood. It knows my line. We are all bound now. Reid's breath hitched. The cabin wasn't free. He wasn't free. He hadn't broken the pact, he had merely renewed it, ensuring its continuation through his own blood. The entity wasn't gone. It was merely dormant, waiting, and the cost? It wasn't just his own forgotten memories, but the legacy of a horror that now extended far beyond him, into the very future of his lineage. The wind outside howled, a mournful, knowing sound, and for the first time, Reid understood the true depth of his inheritance. Reid's breath hitched, the air catching like glass shards in his throat. He reread the words, his eyes tracing the faded script on the brittle parchment, a cold dread seeping into every fiber of his being. The cabin wasn't free. He wasn't free. The entity wasn't gone. It had simply found a new anchor, a new vessel, a new way to endure. His own lineage, a fresh vein for its ancient hunger. A low thrum vibrated beneath his skin, a resonance that was not his own, a deep chord struck in the marrow of his bones. He felt the cabin around him, not as a separate entity, but as an extension of himself, its timbers groaning in unison with the new, subtle ache in his joints. The scent of decaying leaves and wet earth, a smell that had haunted his dreams, now seemed to cling to his clothes, his hair, his very pores. He was a walking reliquary. He left the cabin at dawn, the forest floor still slick with night dew. He didn't lock the door, there was no need. The cabin was tethered to him now, an invisible thread stretching across the miles. He imagined its windows, like vacant eyes, watching his departure, not with malevolence, but with a profound, patient satisfaction. The air itself felt heavy with the pack's lingering presence, a silent promise whispered on the wind that rustled through the ancient trees. Each step away was a step deeper into a new kind of confinement. The journey was a blur of asphalt and passing landscapes, yet Reid saw none of it. The world outside felt muted, distant, as if he were observing it through a thick pane of glass. People on the roadside, their faces animated by ordinary concerns, seemed impossibly naive. How could they not feel the tremor beneath the surface of everything? How could they not sense the ancient, hungry things that lurked just beyond the veil of their perception? He drove until he saw the stark silhouette of the abandoned lighthouse against the bruised dawn sky, a lone sentinel on a craggy promontory overlooking the churning gray expanse of the ocean. He needed the vastness, the emptiness, a place where he might feel less confined, less watched. The air here was sharp, invigorating, yet it couldn't scour away the residue of the cabin. At the top, in the lantern room, the glass panes were grimy, etched by years of wind and spray, offering a distorted view of the horizon. He stood there, watching the relentless rhythm of the sea, the endless expanse of water and sky. He pressed his forehead against the grimy glass, feeling the slight vibration of the structure in the wind. Then, a flicker caught his eye. Not outside, but within the glass itself, reflecting his own image. He leaned closer, peering into the clouded surface. His face stared back, gaunt and etched with a weariness that went beyond mere sleepless nights. But it was his eyes that held him captive. And in their depths, just beneath the surface, he saw a faint, almost imperceptible glimmer. A pinprick of ancient light, like a spark from a dying ember, yet undeniably present. Reveal/discovery, it was the entity. Not a separate presence, not a whisper in the shadows, but a nascent spark within him, a permanent resident. The pact hadn't just been renewed, it had been integrated. He was the cabin now, and the cabin was him. The entity had found its truest home, not in wood and stone, but in flesh and blood. A low, internal hum resonated, a sound that was both comforting and terrifying, a deep vibration of belonging. He understood then. The horror hadn't ended. It had merely changed form. He would learn to live with this new companionship, this permanent scar. The world still spun, the waves still crashed, but for Reid, everything had fundamentally shifted. He was free of the cabin, yes, but forever bound to what lay within.